Well, welcome everybody back to Ministers Joe and Josh Discuss. Today, we are in Genesis chapter 30, beginning in verse 25. Are you ready for this one, Minister Joe? We can talk about sheep and goats and speckled and mottled and breeding habits and accusations of theft.
Sticks in the water,
Scandalous.
all kinds of stuff. Yeah, all kinds
This
of
one's
crazy
scandalous. Stuff. And thankfully, I did some research on this one. I was telling Minister Joe, I did some research on this passage like a month and a half ago because I wanted to use this story as an illustration in a sermon. And the research was so convoluted and so intense, I thought, I can't use this. This has to be a sermon by itself. So I didn't use it, but I'm so glad to have done the research. So I'll bring that to the table, some of my commentary research when it comes to this question of how you make animals give birth to speckled things.
Yeah.
I'll tell you a story from my grandmother too. But we've kind of gotten past the birth of all of Jacob's sons except for one. So Benjamin has not yet been born, who's going to be the youngest child of Rachel and her last child, which youngest usually are the last child. Do you agree?
Unless it's unexpected, huh?
Yeah, I guess. So we're through. Benjamin has been born, but everybody else has been. And then the last episode was all told from Leah and Rachel's perspectives. And now we're going to come back to Jacob's perspective. And it's hard for me to know, and I don't know what you think about this, Minister Joe, whether what we're going to read here was happening at the same time as the last story or if it's after it. I think my instinct is to say it's happening at the same time, that while all this stuff was going on at home, now we're getting the story of what was going on in the fields with Jacob and why he was coming back so late all the time and, just getting pointed to which tent he was going to. And he's like, yeah, whatever, like
sheep. All we know is sheep.
Exactly. So that's the way I tend to read it instinctively, but we'll see as we read through the story if that's right. One thing that's important, and I like what we're doing, is that we're reading this as we're talking about it. Like apart from the fact that I happened to do a bunch of research on this because I was preparing for a sermon, we haven't really done that. And so I noticed this, Minister Joe. I don't know if you noticed it, but when we get to chapter 31, there was a verse that may prove the two of us wrong. Because in verse 1, it talks about Laban's sons being angry about how their father's been treated by Jacob. And I thought, whoa, we didn't think there were sons. Where have these guys been? So we're going to get to that in chapter 31. But what that shows you is we're not really reading ahead. We're not doing a ton of research. We're responding to the text as we read it, because this is supposed to be what anybody could do if you just sit down and talk about what you're reading. So I think even we're going to get surprised at a few details here.
Oh, boy.
I read it just today, and I was like, what? Why was Rachel watching the sheep? What's going on with these guys? Bunch of lazy sons?
Yeah, they were gamers, I guess.
I guess. Yeah, so anyway, we'll get to that when we do. But we are in verse 25 for now, and I'm going to read some of it. And it's a bit laborious passage. We may not read every verse. Minister Joe can put up the stop sign on his screen when he's had enough of the reading.
Let's see if I can find that one.
Yeah.
Stop sign? No, there's no stop sign.
There's like a hand. Isn't there a hand you can put up?
There's a clapper and then a thumb. I don't see any stop sign.
Okay.
Maybe this one. That one work for you?
Yeah, that'll work. That'll work. Or a coffee cup that says I need to take a break.
I'm not sure how to get that off of there, though.
It just goes away, I think, by itself.
Okay. All right.
So verse 25, this is again the New Revised Standard Version. When Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me away, that I may go to my own home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I've served you, and let me go. For you know very well the service I've given you." So we know that this has got to be at least 14 total years, right? Because he's finished apparently his 7 years. So it looks like it took a long time, 7 years for Rachel to have Joseph, if I'm reading this correctly. So anyway, but Laban said to him, "If you'll allow me to say so, I've learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages, and I will give it. Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I've served you and how your cattle have fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it's increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed you wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? He said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you shall not give me anything if you will do this for me. I will again feed your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep and every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and such shall be my wages. We'll stop there just for now.
Ooh.
All right, a few things there at the beginning. So it begins with Jacob's request to go home. I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah. Wow. Begins with the yeah.
So he's got to have finished his 14 years, as I said.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So he finished his 7 years for Rachel. He now has 11 sons and at least one daughter, and he wants to go home.
Yeah. I guess if I were Laban, I would say, "Where's home, buddy?" You know. I wonder if Jacob ever told him the story about Esau, and
Yeah.
there's got to be that desire to move on from there. I mean, it had to have been uncomfortable for Jacob to be there.
Yeah. And we remember that experience at Bethel, where he saw the incline or the stairway going up into the heavens, and realized that it put its foot down in Bethel, and so he named that place the house of God.
Mm-hmm.
He still has a very strong visceral vision given to him that it is the land of Canaan, where God has called him, and that's where God made his covenant with him. It's where he made it with Abraham. It's where he made it with Isaac, and so he knows he can't stay here.
Right.
Now, we don't know if Laban knows that, but I'm sure Laban has a pretty good memory of Isaac taking Rebekah away, and maybe even Abraham leaving.
Mm-hmm.
So this is what we've been waiting for. The impression of the story is that Jacob's only been hanging around in Haran this long because of these agreements that he made with Laban that he would work. So this is bound to happen. But Laban doesn't want him to go. And I find it very interesting why.
Well, yeah, he definitely admits to Jacob that he's the one, because Jacob's there, he's been blessed.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he uses the word divination for figuring that out.
Right?
You know.
So this is a very interesting word. How far to go with this?
You can get slippery, can't it?
It can. So the consonants, some of you are taking Hebrew with me. Minister Joe says seeing the Hebrew hurts his eyes. So I won't put it on the screen for you, Minister Joe.
Oh, you can put it up. I'll tolerate it. Just cover one eye.
So the word for divination, the consonants in English letters would be N, CH, SH. So in Hebrew, those letters are Nun, Chet, and Shin. And when it has pataks under it, which are short A's, Nachash, it means divination.
Mm.
When it has a little different vowels and it's pronounced Nechash, it's the serpent from the Garden of Eden.
Interesting.
He learned by divination. You might even say he learned from the serpent.
Interesting.
Very interesting use of word. Now, this word for divination, so maybe we should talk about what divination is. What do you think?
You can, yeah. I mean, there's some more modern thoughts, I think, that people would probably go directly to at this point, and probably consider it more like witchcraft. But there's probably that end of it
Yeah, it's so I'm going to say this part and then I'll look up a little more formally so I can help people know where this word occurs in the scripture so they could do a little research on their own. But I'll give you a bit of what I was taught when I first encountered this word. So to divine something is to try and determine the truth of a thing through mystical means. So if you divine the future, you try and figure out what's going to happen based on mystical means. And so some of the common ways of divining the future in this time were like looking at animal entrails. You cut open the animal, you look at their entrails, particularly certain organs, and based on the shape of the organ or whether or not there was any scarring on the organ or whatever else, there are people trained to do this, they could predict very specific future things based on the entrails. So that was a type of divination. Probably today, the most common type of divination, or there are several. One would be like a horoscope, which is a very generic type of trying to tell the future based on personality types associated with different astronomical signs, or palm reading. We're trying to predict the future by looking at the lines on the palm, or a crystal ball. Where people claim that they can see the future in that. Sometimes people read tea leaves. This is all divination. Divination is about trying to uncover mysteries through mystical means. So we don't know the exact type of divination that he used, but it's interesting that the word for divination in the scriptures and the word for the serpent in the garden are built on the same consonants. Their vowel pointing is different, but they're built on the same consonants. And if you know Hebrew, you know the consonants carry the base meaning. So there's something about divination in the serpent that is correlated in the scriptures. And so Laban has tried, he's done very, very well. And he wants to know why. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because when people do well, they want to know why things are going well. Because if you can figure it out, you can reduplicate that success in the future. Businesses do it all the time, right?
Yep.
So he realizes his flock's doing great. He's never had such productive animals. He's never had so much wealth, and he would like to know why. So he does some kind of divination. Casting lots could also be a type of divination, depending on how it was used. In Israel, they cast lots in a non-divining way, in this way, but maybe a little. Anyway, probably animal entrails would be my guess. And somehow he has determined that Jacob is the reason. And we know that that's true. And this leads into a subcurrent in the Hebrew Bible. The scriptures, especially when we get to the law of Moses, does not prohibit divination because it doesn't work or because it's superstitious. It prohibits it for another reason. In fact, in the scriptures, divination often does work. And the question is, well, why then won't God let us use it? And looking into the future or trying to discover yourself through mystical means, hidden things, goes against the law of Moses. God can volunteer the future, but anytime his people seek it, that knowledge is called divination. So all of that is bound up in here. We see Laban is a man of his culture because divination is common practice in the ancient Middle East, as far as we can tell. There are lots of different ways of doing it. But so anyway, we start with that. He has used what will be prohibited by the law of Moses to determine what we already knew was true, that God is with Jacob. And because God is with Jacob, God has been with Laban. And now Laban has to decide, how can I keep the good times rolling if the guy who's being blessed leaves?
Right.
And that's what prompts us. But I want to give you a chance to respond to that, and I'll do a little search so I can tell our people other places this word occurs.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I think there's a common linked desire within humanity to want to be able to predict to some degree the future, to be able to, I mean, to make a reasonable decision about anything, right. we need to be able to have some kind of notion or direction or whatever. Otherwise, we're just stumbling into the future. And so that there's a part of that, but there's also what are we willing to sacrifice in order to do that. And you're going to probably look up some other ones like with Saul and some of the things that he did to get to know the future.
Yep. Saul did the same thing with Samuel, right?
Yep.
He tried to call up that was not technically divination in Saul's case. That was a consulting of the dead, which is, it is for the future. So I guess you could say it falls under the broad category, but that actually has a special category of its own.
Yeah, it was a witch or something like that.
Yeah, it was a witch who did it.
Yeah.
Yeah, consulting the dead.
But even there's the reference of Joseph in Egypt, knowing some things that way. So
Yep.
There seems to be like a more of a neutral thing there, and what they maybe would have called it there. But the desire to know the future, I think, and maybe this is stretching, maybe this doesn't help, I don't know at all, but I think of Simon the sorcerer in Acts, where we did our study of Acts. He wanted to buy the power of the Holy Spirit, and so in some ways, I think there's a temptation for us to be able to control that.
Yeah.
To be able to manipulate, to profit from it. And so maybe that's what's going on with Laban here, is that it's not so much that he wanted to have his daughters around and his son. I mean, I mean, like I could think of my mom or my in-law saying, I just want my grandkids to be around.
Right.
You know, but it's a different story when you say, well, I've done so much better now. I have more money in the bank because you're living in my house.
Right.
It's such a different story than like, hey, you've been eating all the in my house. You've been living in my house for so long. I've been paying your car insurance and paying for your gasoline while you go to school, that kind of thing. Is a little bit different than saying, well, because you're living in my house, we have more food to eat because you've been bringing the food home, right. Which I think is a little bit different story. But for Laban, it seems like the focus is on his personal gain and not necessarily the welfare of his daughters and Jacob. I mean, let's face it, Jacob has, what did we say, 11 kids by now, and they're, if I know correctly, I mean, big families usually, kids are the ones who do a lot of the work. They help out. The farms in early days. Yeah, kids would be out there doing everything. Matter of fact, one of my friends from childhood, his dad used to say, what do I have kids for if they're not going to work around the house? But that's a sidebar. We're talking about divination. I guess we're still talking about that. And so it seems to me like it has to do with some type of personal gain.
Yeah, it does. Though, just personal direction.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a mild type of divination to say to the Lord, give me an indication of what's coming next.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a mild type of divination. It's somewhat permitted in the law of Moses because they're not looking at animal entrails. They're not reading signs of nature or anything. They're just coming directly to God. And sometimes God will give direction. Like David will come and he'll use Urim and Thummim, which were part of the garment of the high priestly garment, to determine whether God wanted him to do something. So sometimes David would say, do you want me to attack these people here or do you not? And somehow through this Urim and Thummim, which nobody knows what it looks like, nobody knows how it worked, God would indicate whether he wanted David to do something or not. And you might say that's soft divination in a technical sense because David is asking for guidance for the future, but it's different because it's guidance. Divination is an attempt to uncover the future. What is going to happen next? And you might find that there's divination today. The most common way of doing divination is mathematics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Looking at mathematical projections. That is a contemporary, modern, rationalistic type of divination. Mm-hmm. So like with COVID, this happened, right? You do your mathematical models and you demonstrate what is likely to happen in the future based on the current trends. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what they were doing with animal entrails. With animal entrails, it's far less, precise, but they're looking at different signs in the internal organs of an animal that might indicate to them what's going to happen next. And we kind of do it with animals too. Like animals can give you an indication of the pressures of nature. They can give you an indication of diseases that might be going on. They can give you an indication of what kind of a winter you're likely to have. Like, have you ever, the Farmer's Almanac still does this, right? Based on like the habits of how early are the birds migrating this year and what numbers are they migrating? How robust have the oak trees been in the production of acorns, and how the squirrel's been hoarding. Is there excessive hoarding this year of resources or not? This idea that there might be signs in nature about what to expect, right? El Nino, La Nina. This is all divination. Now, when I would say, I don't want people to start freaking out going, you mean I can't watch the Weather Channel? But my point is the desire to reach into the future and try and determine the likely events that are coming. That's what divination was all about. Now, they had very specific ritual ways of doing it. What I want our people to realize is that this is very common in the ancient Near East. In fact, Joseph will even say later that he learned by divination so-and-so. Now, he's lying. Mm-hmm. We'll have to deal with why Joseph lies to his brothers. But he still uses the phrase, which makes it sound like if his brothers knew what he was talking about, they either knew Egyptians did this or maybe they still did it. Mm-hmm. So divination. But what it becomes illegal in the law of Moses. The verse is here. So this is in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 26. You shall not eat anything with its blood. You shall not practice. Is that a word you've seen before, Minister Joe?
No idea.
Augury.
Yeah.
We're going to have to Google that one. But anyway, the word underneath it is the word nachash. It's the same word used for divination in Genesis earlier. So that's where it becomes, and then witchcraft is also illegal, which is a different word, anan. Is the word for that. So anyway, augury, but it's the word nachash, and I cannot stress too feverishly that these are the same consonants as the word for serpent, and this same word is used for divination and for the appearance of serpents. So it also occurs, you remember in the book of Numbers, when the serpents come after and I preached on this actually, when the serpents come after the Israelites and then Moses makes the bronze serpent, it's usually seraphim that come after him. Fiery serpents is how it's usually translated. Yeah. But on a couple of occasions in that verse, when they're talking about the snakes, nachash occurs as well. So it's very, very interesting. The nachash seraph is the more normal word for serpent. Nachash is very rare. And when it has definite article, it refers to Satan. Well, it refers to the serpent, who later gets associated with Satan in the biblical tradition. But anyway, so I want you to know that kind of thing. So we got some weird stuff going on here. This is a different kind of house. Laban, and we're going to find out later, he also has household gods. Right. So it's just interesting to me that Abraham's logic for wanting to get Isaac a wife from Haran is that he doesn't want his son to marry the Canaanites, presumably because of their pagan behaviors. And yet, how is Laban any different? Yeah. So he gets involved in this divination, and by divination, he determines that the reason he's being blessed is Jacob. And now he wants to hold on to him.
Right. Yeah, or at least stay around so he can reap the benefits from it.
Yeah. Yep. So he enters into negotiation. They've already done this once before. They did this with the wives, right? And last time, Jacob, you thought, I didn't say anything. I kind of stayed neutral, but you thought he got the short end of the stick. You thought he's being taken advantage of, worked 7 years. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I kind of agreed with you a little bit, but I kept myself neutral because I don't know enough about the culture to know whether that was a good deal or if he was being taken advantage of. But we're going to see here that probably you were right. Yeah. Because Jacob does accuse him of taking advantage of him.
Yeah, he hasn't taken any wages, he says.
Yeah. Well, because his wages were his wives.
I guess, yeah.
I think that's the implication, that for 14 years he worked for free just for the two women.
Just to have a wife, yeah. That's pretty.
And he got 11 sons. And later on, and I'm anticipating just a little bit, his wives are also going to show that they're frustrated with their father because he hasn't given them any inheritance or dowry.
Right.
So interesting, right?
Yeah.
So Laban enters into negotiation by saying, name your wages and I'll give it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's an interesting way to begin a negotiation because he's already told Jacob that he's learned by divination that Jacob's the reason for all the wealth.
Right.
You don't tell the goose that lays the golden egg that he is the goose laying the golden egg, do you?
Right. Yeah. I don't know.
He must have known Jacob already knew. You know.
Oh, it was that obvious, I'm sure.
Yeah, I don't know why you needed divination for this.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, anybody could have told you that. Could have been that statue, or you look out the backyard, you see all the goats and sheep in the backyard.
Yeah.
Gee,
will you
those
please
all come
leave
from?
that bird liver alone? We all know why God's blessing.
That's right. It's got nothing to do with you, pal.
So Jacob says to him, he more or less goes through his history. You know how I've served you. You know how your animals have done in my care. You had very little before I came. And I mean, he had his daughter taking care of the sheep and she was able to drive it, so it wasn't a great, robust bunch of animals, but it's increased abundantly. The Lord's blessed you wherever I turned. So Jacob does know. And of course, we know that he knew God was going to bless him because God said he was going to bless him at Bethel.
Mm-hmm.
So
and take care of him.
Jacob's not being arrogant here. I guess that's what I want to say. He's not being arrogant. Like, yeah, I know I'm the man.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think he's doing that. I think he's confirming what you learned by divination. I already knew.
Right. Yeah. Because that was the negotiation he made with God. Make sure that I have clothes to wear and food to eat. And
here's the difference between Israel and Gentiles. Gentiles have to guess at why things are happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's what divination's all about because they're not in relationship with God. So they have to grab knowledge any way they can. Mm-hmm. But Jacob already had this knowledge because God gave it to him. And that is, at this point in the story, the biggest difference between Abraham's family and the rest of the nations. The rest of the nations are guessing. Abraham's family is being told. And that's that again establishes even to this day why we have a Bible. Mm-hmm. Why the descendants of Abraham are authorized to write a book that we all now have to read. Mm-hmm. It's because of the special relationship they have with God, and it's being exposed right here. Jacob already knew this. God told him at Bethel he was going to do it. Laban had no way of knowing what was going on. He had to use divination to find the same information. So verse 30, Jacob knows. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? So here Jacob's like, I have 11 kids and I have no wages.
Right. Yeah. How am I supposed to do this?
I mean, he's basically a slave labor.
Mm-hmm.
He has no possessions. He just has children.
A little top heavy, huh?
Yeah. So he said, what shall I give you? Jacob said, you'll not give me anything. If you'll do this for me, I'll keep taking care of your stuff. Let me go through and take all the speckled animals. So it's a little question as to what speckled means. Mm-hmm. He says spotted, which means another word we have to Google.
More than one?
Variegated.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Tammy has a couple of plants like that. They got multiple colors on it.
Yeah. So it might just mean bi or tricolor. Mm. That first word.
Seems like there's only so many colors, though, that a sheep could be, right?
Yeah, you'd think so.
Dirty and
and speckled is a strange word. It's only used in this form of sheep or goats, and nobody quite knows how to translate it. The closest word to it, how do you explain this? The closest word to it means crumbled or easily crumbles like a biscuit or a cake. Mm. But that word is only used of animals. So most translators go into the idea that Laban has a solid color animal, and Jacob is going to take all the rest.
They're like cows. You got Jerseys that are all like tan, and then you have like Holsteins that are like spotted ones, like the old Gateway computers.
Right.
And then you have the ones that look like an Oreo with the black on the ends and white in the middle, cows.
Yeah.
But
it's not as though Jacob's going to go through the flock right now and take them all. What he says is, more or less, every one that's born that has this physical characteristic, these physical characteristics, I'll take.
Yeah, which sounds pretty risky, doesn't it? Because it's like you're not going to leave right away, unless they're going to all have babies all at once.
Now it makes sense in a practical way, because this is a way of easily distinguishing Laban's flocks from Jacob's pay, right? Laban's flocks will look this way, Jacob's will look this way. So it very clearly distinguish. But it is risky, right?
Oh, yeah.
For both men, it's a bit of a gamble. I mean, how do you know what the animals are going to produce?
Right.
Now, if you wanted to ensure that you would have solid color animals so as to avoid paying Jacob any money or very little, what would you do?
Well, part of it, as I know the story, but you think you'd keep him close. The ones that were like that, you wouldn't allow them to mingle. It's pretty much, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you think? What do you think Laban does? Laban says, "Good, perfect." And then in verse 35, he removed all the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had white on it. That's right. Interesting, right?
Let's have a feast.
And
right?
every lamb that was black, and he put those in charge, his sons in charge of those. That's where this comes up. So he has sons.
Right.
This could be a way of talking about the servants in his house. Maybe. But anyway, he has sons. And then he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob pastured the rest of his flock, which is all solid color animals.
Right.
So this looks like it's going to work out to Laban's advantage, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Because he gets to decide which animals Jacob is going to care for. And he gives him all the solid color ones. Like if you want to make sure that you have a bicolor beagle, you're going to make sure its parents are bicolor. Right? On both of them. And that's what he does. If these have two solid color parents, they should produce solid color young.
That's right.
Now, sadly, he turns out to be wrong, but you can understand why that looked right.
Oh yeah. Well, the quick answer maybe for those sons, maybe they're his concubines.
That could be.
Or yeah. So.
Could be, yeah. It's a very interesting dynamic because later on, his daughters will seem to imply that all of his stuff should belong to them. And that sounds like they wouldn't have sons. And yet here we have sons. So it could be a way of talking about his servants, or maybe he does have concubines who actually have male children. We don't know a lot about that.
Yeah.
But here's what Jacob does. This is what required all the research, and then I decided it was too complicated an illustration to use.
So we'll try to deal with it here.
Yeah, we'll try and deal with it here. So Jacob took fresh rods of poplar and almond and plane and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the rods. He set the rods that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is, the watering places, where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the rods, and so the flocks produced young that were striped, speckled, and spotted. Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and the completely black animals in the flock of Laban, and he put his own droves apart and did not put them with Laban's flock. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob laid the rods in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, and they might breed among the rods. But for the feebler of the flock, he did not lay them there, so the feebler were Laban's and the stronger Jacob's. Thus the man grew exceedingly rich and had large flocks and male and female slaves and camels and donkeys.
You got that right? It makes a lot of sense to me.
So what did he do, Minister Joe, essentially?
Well, essentially, he used the laws of attraction. He combined the appetite for food and water with the appetite to connect with the opposite sex.
Yeah. How did that produce speckled and spotted animals?
Well, it appears what's baffling to us is probably the aspects of those types of wood. What I'm guessing was what these certain types of animals were drawn to. They didn't want just the water, but it was the flavor of the water or the actual chewing of the sticks that enabled them to stay longer. And so if they stayed longer, then they would have easier opportunity to make their connections. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm interpreting.
It explains why they would mate there. But how did it guarantee the production of spotted animals from solid color animals? I'm asking you the impossible questions.
It appears that he was able to orchestrate the timing of the events by encouraging proper location of
Yeah, you're struggling. I am too. Like this looks like ancient readers read this as what I'm just awkwardly calling the law of imprinting.
Mm-hmm.
So there was this idea that what must have happened is they must have seen these variegated colors while they were mating, and somehow by seeing those, they produced animals of multiple colors. Mm. And for a long time, people thought that. Matter of fact, this was used as a way of selectively breeding for a period of time. And I know that my grandmother really believed that you could imprint on something. And she used to tell this story of a woman that she knew who saw a man carrying a slab of beef over his shoulder at the center of town. He was walking down with this beef, and it disgusted her. And she was pregnant at the time. And then my grandmother claimed that she had a child born with that birthmark, a birthmark that looked like that on her shoulder. And my grandmother always said, see, this imprinting thing. Now, most people today would say that's pretty superstitious. And we don't really believe in imprinting in that way. Though there are maybe some examples that can't be explained. Like I remember, I don't know if you were told this, Minister Joe, but when I was taught the beginnings of genetics in my high school biology class, they told me that baldness was passed on the X chromosome. And so it's inherited from the mother. And yet we had this family in our church that the mother had a full head of hair, and all of her relatives had full heads of hair. Her father, grandfather, all the way back. Like there were no baldness you could find. But her husband was bald as a cue ball. And all of his sons, he had 4 sons that all bald. Right? And you might argue maybe there's something to the imprinting. Because we know genetically they weren't inheriting that from their father, if science is right. And yet they all ended up looking like him. Could that be an imprinting thing? So my grandmother thought so. So this idea of imprinting, but funny enough, we have a lot of centuries of people trying to do what Jacob did here. And it doesn't work. So there were all these theories in the commentaries I read. This is why I decided not to use this as an illustration. Because my original thought was, I'm going to use this as an illustration of you become what you see. But apparently that's not what this is about.
Yeah.
So I couldn't use that. So what you said is actually the leading theory, that somehow he was using the wood to keep the animals at the trough, either because they were mesmerized by the look of this wood, or because maybe, like you said, they wanted to chew on that soft underbelly by peeling off the bark. But either way, it was getting them to stay. And somehow he was able to realize which males were most likely to produce speckled offspring. And they say, this was the leading theory, that because he had watched both sets of flocks for all that time, he knew which of the solid colored animals were born from speckled parents. So he knew which ones had those genes. And so he made sure those were the ones that mated. And he did this thing with the wood to make sure the female stayed there long enough to be mated with, so he could control who mated with whom. So that's the leading theory in all of my work on the commentaries, that this is Jacob's knowledge of the flocks were so superior to Laban's that even though Laban separated the flocks, Jacob knew which ones had the speckled in their family lines.
He kept good records.
He kept good mental records of which animals, and who knows, maybe tagged animals or something like that. So that was the leading theory. How do you feel about that? I mean, I read it. I mean, do you think that's what's going on, or do you kind of go with my grandmother with the imprinting thing, or is there another option?
I would tend to favor the better records aspect. The imprinting idea, I think the way they summarize this in this one paragraph makes it sound so matter of fact, like this is something that easily done. Anybody could do this. I mean, they make it sound so simple, but reality, I think, is, because if you know some farmers, some of my family, they raise beef. They know every cow, everything, every animal. They have them named. They know it. They know that the characteristics of it.
Yeah.
I remember milking a cow with my cousins, and they'd say, "You stay away from that one. That one will kick you," and had been kicked. And so the point is that they know the characteristics. Now Jacob, more than likely, if you believe in imprinting, sure, fine, but he had 14 years to figure these guys out.
Yeah.
And if we get our records correct, or presumptions correct, when he met Rachel, they probably had 5 or 10 sheep. I'm just joking. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is he had plenty of time to figure them out. Right. And by this time, after 14 years, of that's all you're doing besides making kids. Maybe this is a physical illustration of what he was doing with his own family. I don't know.
Right. Well, and I agree with you. Jacob is an expert on these sheep. 14 years with these animals, and he has had primary care of them, and they have greatly multiplied under his watch. So he I mean, if anybody's going to be an expert on these animals, it's going to be Jacob. So if those are the only 2 options we had, I'm with you 100%. And when I read the commentaries argument, I thought, I hadn't thought about that. That makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But there's one other detail that comes a little later in the story, and makes me go back to the argument we made about the ark. So some people spend a lot of time trying to prove that the ark, based on the specifications of Genesis, would have been watertight, would have been storm worthy, and would have been able to survive. But I indicated that it really didn't matter how he built that ark. God was the one who was going to protect him. So the fact that ark kept him safe was a miracle. Yeah. And there's every indication in this story that what happens is a miracle. Now, and here's my proof of that, and it comes a little bit later. And I always wrestle with the way the commentaries want to make a very naturalistic explanation. And as far as naturalistic explanations go, the one you accepted is the one I would accept. If we want to come up with a naturalistic explanation, the most likely is Jacob knew these animals. He knew which ones had spotted or flecked ancestors in their family lines, and he knew that they were likely to produce them at some point, and so he wasn't worried. But here's the story. This is the very next verses. Jacob heard that the sons of Laban were saying, because he's very productive, Jacob's taken all that was our father's. He's gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. So here are these sons again. And Jacob said that Laban did not regard him as favorably. Jacob saw that Laban did not regard him as favorably as he did before. So then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your ancestors, to your kindred, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah into the field where his flock was, and said to them, I see that your father does not regard me as favorably as he did before, but the God of my father has been with me. And now he tells them a story we didn't know. You know that I served your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me and changed my wages 10 times. But God did not permit him to harm me. If he said the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flock bore speckled. And if he said the striped shall be your wages, then all the flock bore striped. Thus God has taken away the livestock of your father and given them to me. During the mating of the flock, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats that leaped upon the flock were striped, speckled, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I said, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the goats that leap on the flock are striped, speckled, and mottled, for I've seen all that Laban is doing to you. I'm the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. Now leave this land at once and return to the land of your birth. So the simple fact of the matter is, I think the story of Genesis doesn't present this as a way of imprinting or God was doing this.
Yeah, right.
Jacob knew God was doing this. So all Jacob had to do, and that's probably why he did the poplar thing, like you said, to just keep those females at the troughs.
Mhm.
And what Jacob does is he simply makes sure the strongest males are mating with those females. And he knows he's going to get speckled and spotted lambs, not because of the poplar, but because God told him so.
Right.
So it's a miracle.
Right. And then that's almost analogous to the situation when they prayed for the wounds to be open.
Right.
Of his wives. So
Yeah.
I see a similarity. I was going to interject earlier about, Jacob spent a lot of time around the tents at home. I think he got a little training there too.
Yeah.
But that's as a sidebar. But I definitely see this here. It's so much easier when God tells you exactly what to do.
Isn't it so much easier? And now I'm not going to dismiss, if there are people who really believe in the imprinting thing, I'm not going to dismiss it entirely. We do have some examples in nature. Like I remember seeing the story of this moth that was a certain color,
Mm-hmm.
and then a fire went through that area.
Mm-hmm.
And the moth within a generation changed color to match the burnt wood look.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's pretty amazing. There wasn't enough time for natural selection to make that change where, all the brightly colored moths be killed off and then the genes get passed on, the old Darwinian idea. There wasn't enough time for that. The moths changed too quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And you could say that's the watch care of God.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also say maybe there's something that makes the moths imitate their environment. The way a chameleons, I understand, change color, but not always to match their environment, sometimes for mating purposes and things. But in any case, you could have this imprinting idea if you take God out of it.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting is the story in Genesis does not attribute the production of these animals to some mechanical method Jacob discovered.
Mm-hmm.
He associates it with God.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't know Laban changed his wages 10 times. So that means 10 different times through the course of this thing, Laban tried to change which animals belonged to Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
And every time he changed it, they produced the animal he was trying to not give to Jacob.
Right.
So it was God. Just like
Right.
with the ark, just like with it was God. And I do want to observe that even today, when animals radically transform to survive catastrophe, sometimes that may be God too, maybe all the time.
Yeah, that's the biggest hang up with evolution, is that they're survival of the fittest kind of thing. The ability to change that quickly, even in our own persona, the amount of span we have in our life, how much can we actually change?
Right. Yeah. Evolution requires millions and millions of years, or at least great periods of time, to see any real substantial change. And we do observe things changing much quicker than that. Now, the retort to that is, well, why are so many animals going extinct? If God is making sure that they adapt quickly to their environments, then why is he not doing that with frogs in Costa Rica, for instance, where we are losing species by the second, it seems?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I can't answer that. And I'm not saying that God always does this. But we have plenty of examples in Scripture where God is still actively involved in nature.
Mm-hmm.
And he's still actively involved I think of Job, where God says to Job, do you wait for the deer to give birth? Do you count the days? And my response to that is, if I were Job, and I don't think I actually would. When you're talking to God, you're probably going to shut up like Job did. But my internal response would be, do you? Because the implication is he does.
Yeah.
The implication through Job there at the end is that God actually deeply cares for the animals. and that he is actually watching over them, and he may not choose to spare them all. He may not choose to save them all, but he does, well, not a sparrow falls apart from my Father's will, which doesn't mean that he causes everyone to fall that does, but it does mean that God has to choose not to rescue the ones that die. So it's a very interesting connection with nature. And here Jacob doesn't tap into some mysterious knowledge by divination that you can make speckled sheep by tearing certain patterns into wood bark. But
you don't need divination if God's telling you.
This is the work of God.
Yeah.
It's a miracle.
I mean, going back to the imprinting, though, some of the thoughts that come to my mind is there are definite things that we see that we interpret. We go back and interpret and say, yeah, well, I can see how there's a connection there. Yeah. But to predict the future is a whole nother thing. I mean, to be able to say, because the guy was carrying a side of beef on his back, now your son's going to have a birthmark on his back.
Yeah.
I don't see that as imprinting. Imprinting to me is more along the following the along what I understand as imprinting is more along the lines of an introduction to something, and you want to copy that behavior. Yeah. Right. I mean, it can almost be a beautiful thing if we're talking about Christ-like behavior. Paul said that idea of
like the way a baby duckling imprints on its mother and will follow it wherever it goes. Like that kind of imprinting would be a different type. Maybe imprinting wasn't the right language to use, but
yeah, but I can see how people would try to interpret that paragraph, because it's like it says it so matter of factly. It's like you're almost like, whoa, but then you read on, and I'll admit it right now, I'm embarrassed that I don't feel like I'm that far ahead of it right here. As we're talking, it says, should have known this already. My goodness.
Yeah, it's tough though, right? I mean, yeah, so I'm thinking about how many farmers in history thought, I'm going to benefit from this thing. I'm going to tell my lead guy that I'll take only the speckled animals, and I'm going to do this poplar thing, and it's going to work out. And then they're going to be like, what in the world? This doesn't work at all.
What happened?
Why doesn't this work?
Then the preacher comes along and says, did God tell you to do that?
Yeah, exactly. This is a miracle. And we, God often works his miracles through what can appear at a surface look a very natural process. Like how many people have looked at the plagues of Egypt and they've seen it just as a natural process. Something polluted the Nile River, turned it red. That led frogs to leave the water and fish to die. And then once they all died, it led to disease and gnats and flies, as anything would when there are dead bodies everywhere. And then that leads to boils, and that leads to the death of animals. They see it as very naturalistic. And in some ways, you might say, yeah, you can see how it progressed. Of course, the plague of darkness and the death of the firstborn, I'm not sure you can explain in those ways. But you could explain the early plagues that way. But the point is not that there could be a natural explanation. It's the fact that the timing and the prediction and the meaning that was given to them by Moses in advance should have clued the Egyptians in. But you can see why the Egyptians ignored the early plagues, because it looked like Moses was just taking credit for a natural process.
Yeah.
But every now and again, then you run into one you can't explain. But that doesn't mean in time you couldn't explain it. Like I know that some today say that the plague of darkness in Egypt was the result of a volcanic eruption, and some people even think they know which volcano erupted based on the timing and all. So, even if there were a naturalistic explanation, the naturalistic one will never be sufficient.
Right.
And so here we have an example of another miracle. And I liked your explanation. As a matter of fact, you came to that just by your wits, when the scholar that I read took a while to discover it, that this mostly likely would have been just keeping the females at the trough.
Yeah. So
Jacob could decide which ones got mated with.
I mean, visually and the whole scenario, I mean, that seems brutal, but that's the way they do cattle now. I mean, they put them in a head stanchion. I mean,
I watched a video, little off track, of a woman who has pretty severe autistic tendencies. I don't know if it's Asperger's or she's just somewhere else on the spectrum, but pretty severe. And she's made her fortune working with cattle slaughtering enterprises because she has the ability to think like an animal because she's so instinctive. And she was able to get down on her hands and knees and see these when they're leading them into slaughter. They were having trouble because the animals would get log jammed and they wouldn't go in and they get anxious. And they, humans think, well, the animals know that they're going to be slaughtered. That's why they're doing this.
Right.
But of course, that's not the case at all. Animals don't think like that. So she was able, thinking, she says, in the autistic brain, she thinks a little more like an animal. She can't shut off the stimuli. She was able to walk through these things and see what was distracting them. And when they saw something like a flag or something else, they would just stop and stare at it. That's kind of what Jacob is doing with these animals, right? And so she figured out how to move them in such a way that they wouldn't get distracted by anything and they would just keep moving. And she made a lot of money in slaughter because it works.
Wow.
But that's kind of what he's taking advantage of, right? The tendency of an animal to stare at something it doesn't recognize. Like my beagle, every time she goes outside and sees a stationary object she doesn't recognize, she'll bark at it till she goes hoarse.
Yeah, right. Or the squirrel behind my house that weighs like 15 pounds. He's a huge one. He's
Really?
big. He's a big one. I'm like, what is he? Where's that one coming from?
Yeah.
It's almost like a small dog.
You sure you're not talking about the groundhog?
No, not the groundhog. That one's like a wrestler. He's so big.
Yeah, so there are these instincts of animals, but what's essential to the story, as far as I can tell, is that Jacob knew they were going to produce speckled and spotted animals because God had given him a vision and God had told him what to do. And so he just made sure the strongest animals mated, so that his would be the better animals.
Yeah, and I think today they would probably have had some type of flow chart or some kind of genetic. I believe it or not, we didn't talk about this before, but I actually worked at a place where they did genetic engineering on goats.
Oh.
To produce high volume goat milk.
Oh.
And so the whole idea of genetics and controlling of that for mass production, I think, is more valuable than people realize.
I hope nobody is offended at this.
You think so?
But goats freak me out.
Do they? Yeah.
I don't know. There's something about the eyes of a goat. Have you looked a goat in the eyes?
Yeah.
They got a weird iris. I mean, a weird pupil.
Well, especially the ones without ears. You ever seen the ones with no ears?
No.
Oh, they're very different. Very, very different.
The pupils are different?
No, their heads are shaped and they have no ears. They're like little small tabs. And
I don't know what it is about a goat and how it looks at you. But I had a goat. So here, I'm gonna
bring up one.
gonna bring up one. Is that okay with you?
Church. This is a little segue. Coming home from church. That one's bizarre. Wow. That's
You
like
see
a
that?
Square. Yeah.
So anyway, nobody cared about that, but goats really freaked me out.
Yeah,
I had one. We were at this. It's like a petting zoo kind of thing in New Hampshire, and they let all the goats out so you could feed them, and they're very aggressive. And I was holding my map of the place, like this. And this goat, he was a tall goat compared to the other ones. He came up and he looked at me with that eye, and I was mesmerized by the eye. I was looking at it going, that's not a normal pupil. And while I was looking at his eye, he ate my map.
Oh, that's funny.
It's like he was intending to mesmerize me.
He's like, do you want that back?
Just a big bite out of my map. And my kids were with me, and Arne said, why did he eat the map? And I couldn't explain it. I'm like, a goat will eat anything. I'm pretty sure that was an inexact answer, but it's the only one I had.
He was hoping for grain inside of it. Like one of those little cups they used to get the water cooler.
Yeah.
That's how they used to give out the grain, to feed it to game farm. So he probably thought it was that. He's like looking for the grain inside of it.
I mean, it was a map that had colored ink, and it wasn't glossy, like it didn't have like a plastic covering, but it was a little glossy paper.
Yeah. Well, that's even better because they probably use the vegetable ink in it,
Oh, maybe.
It's yummy.
I don't know.
purple tongue after
Anyway,
that, probably.
I don't know why we got into that.
Side
Well,
note.
it's not direct.
That's right.
Yeah, even though in modern pop culture, Satan gets associated with the goat now, right?
Yeah.
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 So
That's
anyway,
because of the pentagram, right? Is that why?
your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, I thought it was because it kind of gives the shape of the pentagram.
So
The
here's
horns, the horns and stuff.
okay, are you ready for, oh man, I should talk about things I haven't researched thoroughly. But this comes,
We're gonna get in trouble now.
yeah, this comes from I was a literature major in my undergrad, and I focused on English literature, and I took one class in Middle English. We studied Chaucer and Baldassare, Castiglione, and a couple others, but Chaucer is the one I remembered. And it was in my study of Chaucer that I learned about the cuckold. Do you know what that is? Cuckold?
I'm barely with you, man. We got one wheel on the track.
So when a person was cuckolded, it's when their spouse cheated on them and they became jealous.
Oh.
When they became jealous, they were said to be cuckolded, which is a male goat.
Mm-hmm.
It'll look like a male goat. My understanding is that Satan was presented as a cuckold, the horns and all that, as a way of mocking him, the way that a cuckolded husband was mocked by the affair of his wife. And my understanding was that's why he was presented with the goat look. It was meant to make fun of him.
Right.
So I don't know if that's true in the sense that I've never done a history of Christianity study on it. But that is what my literature professor told me in my Chaucer class about the cuckold and its relation to Satan. The pentagram thing that you said, maybe that's true, but that didn't come up.
Right, yeah.
But pentagrams, goats, funny enough, he's a serpent in the scriptures. Why are the serpents never associated? Why is he a goat?
Yeah, it's bizarre.
Isn't that interesting? Instead, the serpent is on our medical pictures.
Right, yeah. I thought that was the Asherah pole.
Yeah, it could be. Could be. But I thought that image might have come from Egypt. But yeah, it could be the pole.
Yeah, or the connection with Moses and the fiery serpents.
Yeah,
thing.
The seraphim. Yeah.
Yeah. The interesting thing, though, just to throw another sidebar in here and make us kind of crazy, was, if Laban was so sharp with his divination, you sure think that he would have figured this out. If he changed it 10 times, he must have done a lot of been wrong.
Yeah.
Quite a few times.
Yeah, this divination was not reliable.
It's not working. Give it up, Laban. You got it wrong.
So the story ends with he's telling his wives that story. And Rachel and Leah answer him. I'll put it on the screen because we might as well wrap out these verses.
Yeah.
Then Rachel and Leah answered him, "Is there any portion or inheritance left to us in our father's house? Are we not regarded by him as foreigners? For he sold us, and he's been using up the money given for us. All the property that God has taken away from our father belongs to us and to our children. Now then, do whatever God has said to you." Yep. So if we wondered how Laban's daughters felt about him and the game that's been played with them, we just found out.
Oh, yeah. They're sick and tired of it.
And they're pretty happy to see Jacob pillaging him.
Yeah. Well, I think they felt a little cheated in the beginning anyway.
Yeah.
And that rings back to that full circle.
And this again brings us to this question of sons. They seem to indicate that all their father's wealth rightfully belongs to them. So again, we ask, what are these sons? And you might be right. Maybe it's concubines, or they could be servants in his household who, because he has no sons, are his heirs, the way Eliezer was Abraham's heir. So maybe it's sons in a very loose sense. We don't know.
Yeah, they may be pledged to him. I mean, in his old age, maybe. I mean, just think about it. If you didn't have any sons, maybe the way to go back then was like, yeah, okay, I'm gonna let you live here. You guys take care of my property, but until I'm an old man, and you can have whatever's left.
Right.
kind of thing, kind of a live in trust kind of thing.
Yeah, but his daughters are perfectly happy that he's been bilked, and they're all with Jacob going away.
Right. Yeah. Well, I tend to feel like they're really saying, hey, Jacob, uh, he only has this because you made it for him, and
Right.
so he's been stealing from us all along,
Right.
So
And not what you would expect daughters to say of their father, but we've been talking about it throughout this little journey through Jacob's experience in Haran, just how rough a relationship there seems to have been.
I mean, it is quite interesting to notice as well that actually Rachel and Leah actually agree on this.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because they've been competitive all the way through, right?
Yeah. I mean, they're like, yeah, let's get out of here.
Do you think that when Rachel finally has Joseph, that settles things for her a little bit?
Well, I mean, there is that anticipation of what she says about after Joseph, as if she thinks that she should have more kids, and
Yeah.
so I wouldn't say it's exactly settled, but I think that maybe she is maybe a bit distracted by the inflation of the purse of
Yeah.
Of Jacob. I mean, some women are very encouraged in life by the size of the money in the wallet.
So you think it was the money that united them, not the children?
I think so. The prosperity. I mean,
Or their mutual dislike for their father.
Yeah, but I mean, if we were to have a family council and you get this revelation. Well, this is God. It's been telling me to do this, and things are looking good. I mean, it'd be a lot different if Jacob were to say, "Oh, we're going to lose everything, and we're going to have to eat porridge for the rest of our lives." They might not be so excited to want to leave.
Yeah.
But I think they're saying now's the time to go when the stock markets, the banks are looking full.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can't get any better than this, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
And Laban's saying we're too big to fail. We need keep passing the bailout.
Yeah. Yeah. So and Jacob realizes, it seems, and we'll get into this next time, that Laban's not really going to just let him go. Yeah. So he's gonna pull what he pulled to leave his home. He's gonna get out of Dodge quick, but this time he's got a lot to take with him.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's always the big thing, right? The transport. I mean, you get called as a pastor to move halfway across the country.
Yeah.
You got to decide what's going, what's not, right?
You do. Yeah.
It's 800 miles back, right?
Right. 800 miles back.
And
he's got to travel. It's going to take him a long time. He's got 11, 12 kids, probably more, probably the daughters that aren't mentioned. And he's got all these sheep. He's got two wives and 2 concubines. He's got quite an entourage that's going to go with him. So this is going to be a long trip. If it was long the way coming out, it's going to be way longer going back.
Yeah. Yeah. And you got all that, prepper and feeding all those mouths to feed. And so strategic exit there, as opposed to just.
Funny enough, again, the Lord's the one who tells him to leave.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't really have. Do you think, if we're just looking at this as just practically minded people, with all that, he doesn't have much chance of outrunning Laban?
No.
I mean, because Laban could just chase him on his own with a couple of guys.
Right. Yeah. A fast donkey or a fast camel, he's got him. No problem.
Yeah. So Jacob, I mean, he's going to choose. That's what we'll see next time. He's going to choose the time of his departure very carefully, but still. I mean, without God's help, he's not going to make it.
Yeah, he would need a really fast train, and they don't have them by then.
Right. Yeah. So, well, thank you, Minister Joe. Do you have any final words from this story as we wrap it up?
Well, I would say that I mean, this is it seems like. This is like maybe the parable. I mean, we got to be careful because this could open a big can of worms. But the parable in the Gospels where it talks about the shrewd manager, where we see some of these principles involved here, where but in the New Testament, Jesus says to him, use your worldly gain for the kingdom.
Yeah.
So in other words, so I think Pray With This says more about God's provision and working in Jacob's life than actual the other dynamics that are there. I mean,
Yeah.
these are not principles you want to be using on your in-laws. No.
No.
You know.
And you can bring up the shrewd manager, but to my sense, in this story, Laban is the one who's more shrewd than Jacob. But Jacob comes out the better because he is obedient to God.
Right.
And so I think God makes Jacob's plans work.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not that Jacob is being particularly crafty. I mean, he already knew. You know what I mean? Like, it wasn't like he was gambling on what colors to say would be his fee,
Mm-hmm.
because God was with him. It was almost as though anything he said,
Right.
that's what he was going to get. So, sometimes you can think of Jacob, as you look at the story, as very shrewd, but I think we've demonstrated in our conversations that Jacob is actually not the author of most of his successes. Like, we talked about the fact that it was Rachel's idea to deceive Rebecca's idea to deceive Isaac, not Jacob's. And it seems to us, at least it seems to me, that Isaac was complicit in his own being deceived. I think he wanted to be deceived. And so Jacob is just kind of a pawn in that game, but he gets all the blame and gets chased out of Dodge. And then he comes here, and it seems to me that it all works because God makes it work.
Yeah.
So, Jacob I like him as a character, but I'm not going to give him a lot of credit for his successes.
Mm.
My sense is he's a hard worker. He does what he's told because he obeys God. When God tells him to do things, he does it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only credit I think he gets, is that he's got a lot of chesed. He sticks with his agreements. He fulfills his vows. He works hard, and he does what God tells him. And those things do work out for him.
Mm-hmm.
So in that way, yes, he has some responsibility, but I don't know if I would call him shrewd. I would say he's more obedient.
Yeah. Well, I think some people, when they read that one paragraph, they tend to think, "Oh yeah, he's slick."
Yeah, until you read the next paragraph. That's why you have to read it in context, right?
Yeah, he definitely admits it though. You got to give him credit for that.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people would just be like, "Yeah, this is what I did, and this
Right.
is how you do it," and watch people down the road 100 years from now are going to try and do the same thing, but they're not going to be as successful because I know how to do it.
Right.
There's a lot of people that fall into that.
Absolutely. They take credit for things that they had no control over. I dealt with a person who was very successful quite a number of churches ago, very, very successful, and attributed all of his success to his own hard work ethic, and was very critical of anybody who didn't succeed because he felt they were just lazy.
Yeah.
But when he told me the story of how he got to where he was, boy, there was a lot of happenstance in that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even successful people, things have to fall their way.
Right.
What are the odds when Bill Gates is putting forward BASIC, whatever the original program was that he had invented? There were other people who also had programs.
Mm-hmm.
It just seemed like his was chosen.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, maybe, I don't know if he was smarter than everybody else, if he was slicker in how he sold it. Maybe he was. But the simple fact is, things have to drop your way. There are plenty of people who could have been movie stars, right? But things didn't work out. They didn't get seen at the right time by the right person. They didn't get the right role, or they ran into the wrong agent, or whatever it is. Athletes too. We often joked around when we played basketball, in this, in just town leagues and stuff, that some people just had a bad break. They're just as good as some of the people that came out of our area. We had a number of people came out of our area. Patrick Ewing came out of Boston, and Travis Best came out of Massachusetts. Played just before me. They all ended up NBA players. But we remembered seeing other people play against them who gave them a game, who didn't do anything.
Right.
Never went anywhere. They didn't get recruited, whatever it was. So, even the very successful people sometimes take too much credit for their own success. Jacob doesn't do that.
Right.
Jacob recognizes that God's providence is with him.
I mean, even if Jacob would have stayed home, didn't go there, you got to wonder if he would have been still as successful. You know,
Yeah, well,
I mean,
I would say the key for Jacob is that he's obedient. And I'm not saying obedience always leads to blessing. But in
mhm,
Jacob's case, the covenant that God made with him is that he would bless him.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so Jacob's obedience does correlate to blessing because that was the covenant God made with him. You and I are, of course, under the covenant of Jesus, in which the blessings are different.
Mhm.
Still blessings, though.
Yeah, I don't need any sheep. Do you?
No, I don't need sheep.
I like wool. It's a good feeling, nice and warm.
Yeah. But of
I
course,
don't.
sheep were wealth for
Yeah.
Jacob. And there are still some people purveying that today, that if you're obedient to God, he's going to make you wealthy.
Mhm.
But that's not the new covenant of Jesus. God
Right.
can make people wealthy if he wants to, and he sometimes does. But the covenant of Jesus guarantees us a different kind of blessing. Of course, the
Right.
ultimate blessing being resurrection from the dead and eternal life. But even on this side of eternity, the blessings of God are more about peace in the midst of storms, joy, even in the
Mhm.
midst of suffering, hope, even in the midst of despair. Those kind of blessings are probably better than
Right.
wealth. But um, I remember hearing a comedian say, but all the same, I'd still like the money. And
Mhm.
that is the world, that is the worldly vision. So I don't want to give anybody the impression that the covenant of Jesus is the same, that we're going to get wealthy. But remember, Jacob's covenant was that God would bless him
Right.
materially. And so his obedience is part of that covenant.
Yeah. We probably should clarify here too that because some people are paralyzed by the future. They don't know. They don't know how to make decisions. They don't.
Right.
They don't want to. And then there's other people who will do anything to know the future, including paying people and doing all kinds of
Yeah.
crazy stuff. And so I mean, as Christians, I would encourage us to do what Jacob did. Talk to God, listen to God, and read His Word. Know what the characteristics of God talking to you,
Yeah.
because it's pretty obvious there about the name between divination and the serpent.
Yeah.
So the truth of the matter is that truth can come to us just like Psalm 91, when Jesus was being tempted by Satan. He only quoted part of that verse.
Yeah.
And so the truth was there, but
Yeah.
you got to know the one that's delivering it.
That's right. And if we could say any one thing, I would summarize it this way. I think this is what you're saying. Much more important to know, and to know what God wants you to do today and to do it, than to know what's going to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. And on top of it too is that we don't always get the privilege to control what happens.
No.
There are
And that's the
so
thing. The future is so out of our control. There are two things out of our control: the past and the future. We cannot change the past. So our instinct is to convince ourselves the past had to be that way. That's a self-defense mechanism. Christianity teaches us to look back to recognize the past did not have to be that way, and we do not have to be tomorrow what we were yesterday. And so that's the freedom of Christ, is to even be able to judge our past. But the instinct is to defend our past because we can't change it. And the future, we can't control either, and it's unknown to us. So we're always looking for some way of navigating the unknown that will make it feel safer for us. And that's the tendency to want to divine the future. But the truth is that God can tell us about the future, and often does, especially if the future is very negative and he wants to prepare us for it. He will send warnings. But knowing the future is less important than knowing what God wants us to do today. And I think divination puts the emphasis on the wrong thing. We act as though we can't know what to do today if we don't know what's coming. But the scriptures teach us something else. If you obey today, you can trust God for tomorrow.
Yep. That's well said.
Yeah. So it's an interesting story. I hope that this covering the ground that we have has helped some people. And I hope I don't get my inbox flooded with pictures of goat eyes.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
those are just pictures, I guess. But
I'll love every animal, even if they freak me out.
yeah,
I would take care of a goat if I had one. Chickens, I didn't know what to make of chickens either, but because they can kind of stare at you in a strange way and they peck everything that looks different, so they can feel very aggressive. But now that we have chickens, they're very social animals. I've come to appreciate them. I'm sure if I had goats, I would feel differently, but
Yeah, probably. Yeah, and that's the thing. Like we know people in Vermont have goats and do goat milk and
it's the
cheese.
unknown. It's that unknown future that keeps us scared. It's that unknown.
That's
Once
right.
you know a thing, it's different.
Yeah, and then if you know it well enough, you know enough to stay away from it.
Some things, right?
Yeah.
But let's pray, Minister Joe, for you, for me, and for all of those who listen, that we will not have to learn the hard way.
Right.
Yeah. And, it's probably worth saying in conclusion that there are a lot of Labans out there in the world who want to take advantage, who are always trying to work the angles to make things work out better for them, even if at the cost of people they love, at the cost of their daughters, at the cost of their long-term relationship with the person who is actually benefiting them. There are a lot of Labans out there. They're just looking to consume, and it's more about them and their own survival and their own prosperity. And what's interesting is the story of Jacob. Even though he's dealing with someone like that, he doesn't overcome that person through guile or vindictiveness of his own. God delivers him, and he overcomes that by obedience to God. And it seems to me that is similar to what Paul says in Romans 12, when he says that if we respond to evil with good, if we overcome evil with good, we pour burning coals on someone's head. Now, I've heard a lot of people try and make that positive and say that, people would carry bins of hot coals on their heads, and, to carry them so they could keep a fire in their house or whatever. And that pouring coals on their head is a positive thing. You're helping them. But as much as that historical reconstruction tries to do, it's never been that persuasive for me historically. I think it's still most likely what Paul is saying is that by doing good to them, you'll bring judgment on them and you'll expose them. And Jesus does that. He exposes the true hearts of the Pharisees and the true corruption of the Roman system when they crucify an innocent person. And I think in a sense, Jacob reveals Laban's true heart,
Right,
through his obedience to God. And we should take that as an encouragement that God will bring judgment on our enemies if we are loving and if we're faithful. But if we take vengeance into our own hands, then we're on our own.
Right. That's powerful.
Well, thank you, Minister Joe.
Yeah.
Hope this was useful for people. I had fun today.
Yeah. Thanks again.
All right. We'll see you next time.